welcome to another session of The Giants. My name is Tip. I'm part of the Blackbird team and I'll be your host for today. Justin Angsuwat is the giant in the field of people and company culture. He is the Chief People Officer of Thumbtack, recognized as one of the world's most innovative companies on FastCompany and debuted on a number of Fortune Best Places to Work. Justin was Chief of Staff to the HR team for one of the largest listed companies in Australia before moving to New York and subsequently shoulder tapped by Google to head up the HR team for go-to-market functions. The outcome of the session is to learn ways to build culture in an uncertain world. Justin, it's such a privilege to be spending the next 30 minutes with you. Thank you for joining us today. If you guys have questions for Justin, go to slido.com using hashtag Justin and upvote for your favorite questions there, and make sure you tweet what you've learned in the session using hashtag Giants as well. So without further ado, over to you, Justin, for the presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Tip. Hey, g'day everyone. Really excited to connect with you today, especially on culture in this world of uncertainty. Hope you're all well, especially for those folks in Australia where it's ready tomorrow. Let's go into it. So you might be wondering, who is this guy? And as Tip mentioned, I currently am the Chief People Officer at Thumbtack, which is a unicorn tech company based in San Francisco. Before this was Google, and then before that was consulting in New York, and had a few roles in Australia. Today, I wanted to share 3 ways to build culture in this crazy and uncertain world. And that is to hire well, to measure culture, and to build resilience. And today, I'm going to distill it down to practical takeaways based on experience, data, and science. And we're not going to go into the sausage making behind all of this because we don't have a lot of time, and also I have no idea how to make sausages. First of all, this starts with hiring well. And some of you might have lower hiring volumes right now, and that just makes hiring even more important. In fact, it's the single most important people process you can invest in to impact your culture. One bad hire can have a huge ripple effect on your culture. You can probably think of 1 or 2 right now. So disproportionately invest in hiring over any other people process if you're going to strike the right culture. So how do you go about doing that? Well, first of all, structure the process. Having a structured process helps us to reduce bias and make better decisions. Any one interview is biased. And so ideally, no single person should be able to make a hiring decision on their own. You can do this on one end of the spectrum by having a purely impartial hiring committee that makes all of your hiring decisions for you. Or if you still want the hiring manager to go and make that decision, make sure there's strongly calibrated interview panels whose voices are heard and their feedback is taken into account. And structuring the process also gives you the advantage of letting you run analytics on the process. And so for us, for example, we ran analytics on our process, and we discovered one part of our hiring process was more prone to bias, and we did see more bias in that process. And so we're able to go in there and fix that due to analytics and the structure behind our process. So aside from structuring the process, we've also got to structure the interview itself. Because as humans, we're terrible at estimating our ability to interview really well. And so structuring it helps bring a lot of rigor to the process, including what you're assessing people are on during the interviews. For example, it's really common to assess candidates based on how well they know the role and the technical skills behind that role. And look, this is really important, especially for very technical roles, but it's sometimes overemphasized as the most important thing to hire for. But it's actually much less important as a predictor of success than other attributes. One of the strongest predictors is problem solving. So how good are they at solving problems and then taking those learnings and applying them to different problems in the future? A really good way to test for something like this is to ask a vague or open-ended real-world problem, probably something that you're actually experiencing in your company at the time, and see how they solve it in a world where not all the information or data is there. And another myth is that the solution really matters. The solution itself doesn't actually matter. What matters is how they ask questions, how they structure the problem, how they seek out data to support the problem, how they come up with a range of solutions, and how they decide to narrow down those solutions to a final solution. So that's problem solving. And ties in really nicely to being comfortable operating with ambiguity, because businesses, especially your businesses and a lot of the roles within the business, will continue to change over time. So being able to ensure that people are really comfortable and thrive, or at least be really comfortable operating ambiguity, is a really important thing to test for. A really good way to test for this is to ask for a time when they were being given an ambiguous direction, for example, and understand what they did about it. What you want to hear in that situation is, what was the situation? What did they do to structure it or get clarity? And what was the impact? And in all of that ambiguity, you want them to have a growth mindset. And for those of you that wonder what this San Francisco crunchy, meditation-loving HR person means by growth mindset, it means you want them to be a voracious learner with a good dose of intellectual curiosity. And a really good way to test for growth mindset is to ask them for a time when they experience failure. And what you want to hear in all of that is what happened, what they learned from it, and what they'll do differently next time. Because if someone has raw intellectual horsepower, if they can solve problems, if they're comfortable with ambiguity and have a growth mindset, they can learn a lot of the role knowledge. So they're going to make a great candidate. So if you find someone like that, feel welcome to send me their resume or just hire them yourself. More importantly, if they have those attributes, they can really scale and adapt with your business. And that's what's really important. And that's what might be missed if you focus only on the role knowledge. And last but not least, do they fit with your company values? And values doesn't mean culture fit or is someone like me. It's about defining the values that are specifically most important to your company. And then from those values, what are the behaviors that you expect to see from that, and assess against those behaviors, ideally with the type of rubric. So you've hired the right people. Now what? It's really important to use data to understand your culture and the sentiment of your organization. And engagement surveys are a really great tool to use for this. And there's so many great ones out there, so pick one. The question I get asked most often is, how do I make sense of all this data? Depending on the engagement survey, you might have 30 to 60 questions. You might have thousands of comments coming back. One of the biggest challenges is weeding through all of that and understanding how to make sense of it and what to do about it. So I wanted to share some tips. First one is to work backwards. And the key is to work backwards from what it is that you want to solve for. For example, with engagement surveys, it's really common to solve for two things, which is engagement and retention. So what you can do is you can run regression analyses on these items to find what drives engagement and retention specific to your organization. Or even you can get specific to cohorts, like looking at a specific department, or even your managers or your most tenured employees versus your newest employees or your top performers. Another important signal is looking at year-on-year change, because when you have dozens of data points, it's hard to know where else to focus. Year-on-year change is a much more valuable signal than a benchmark or even the lowest scoring item, because year-on-year change shows a shift in how your people are feeling. And this is one of your most important signals. You might lose some of that signal when you're just comparing it straight to a benchmark. And looking at the lowest scoring item might be great. It's usually performance management. But trying to move that lowest scoring item even 1 percentage point higher might come at a high cost, which doesn't drive engagement or retention. And so I go back to, that's why it's really important to know exactly what it is that you're solving for. And then communicate. Now, the worst thing you can do is ask people for feedback and do nothing with it. Communicate your results. Avoid explaining them away or creating excuses around them, because it's really your chance as a leader to own your results and own your employees' sentiment. And then take one action. Pick one thing to focus on improving and communicate progress against that. And it's important, even in picking this one thing, to use your data and analytics to make sure you're solving for the right thing. You know, it reminds me of this study that was done that looked at a few hundred soccer goalkeepers during penalty kicks. And what was interesting was they analyzed the goalkeepers, and 50% of the time they would dive to one side, 45% they would dive to the other side, and 5% of the time they'd stay in the middle. Then they analyzed the kickers. the penalty takers. And they found that kickers sent the ball to the middle nearly 35% of the time. So the researchers went and talked to the goalkeepers and they asked them why. Why did you dive to the side when statistically it's more likely they'll just kick it straight down the middle? And a lot of the goalkeepers responded that they would just regret letting in a goal more if they just stood in the middle than if they had dived to the left or the right. Put another way, the goalkeepers wanted to be seen to be doing something, even if that something was statistically wrong. It's human nature, and sometimes we need the data to help us fight against that human nature. For example, once I was working with a leader where their key driver for engagement and retention was hierarchy. And so we were focused on that one thing to address. And their initial gut reaction was to increase the size of teams. So by increasing the size of teams, we reduced the number of managers and then reduced the number of layers in the organization. But when we dug into the data, it turned out that hierarchy was more about perceptions of hierarchy when it came to decision making or who got to attend what meetings that really drove it. And that led to a very different action and saved us from potentially reorganizing several thousand people. So take one action and communicate it. If you remember and use only one phrase, use this one phrase. You told us X, so we did Y. Simple. It's one that I find that just we don't use enough. You told us X, so we did Y. People want to know that you listened to their feedback, you took their feedback seriously, and you're working on it. And then if you want to, measure more. If you want to measure more about your culture, you can. Examples of other things that we've recently measured included looking at bias when we write reviews or give each other feedback, and we noticed a lot of gender bias in how we communicated with each other. You could use consumer preference surveys like max diff surveys or conjoint surveys to see how effective benefits and perks are. You can actually use engagement surveys to measure the effectiveness of a specific program. If you want to roll out a new reward and recognition program, when you manage a program, use the engagement survey to be able to measure exactly how that program performed. Sky's the limit if you've earned the trust of your employees. Third piece is building resilience. Resilience is the ability to bounce back from adversity, or in Mike Tyson's words, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And why is this sense of resilience really important now? And the reason is humans hate uncertainty. And there is so much adversity and uncertainty in the world right now, and we hate it. And the reason why is our brains are constantly assessing the world around us. Our brains are deciding what's safe and what isn't safe. And when we experience uncertainty, our brain makes up all sorts of stories, because to our brain, uncertainty equals danger. And our brains are hardwired to overestimate threats and underestimate our ability to handle them. So it impairs our judgment, it impairs our decision-making, and it also impairs our ability to collaborate with one another. And now that working remotely has become the new norm, this becomes even more important. So what you can do as a leader is think about your resilience as a P&L. You have your estimated monthly burn, but you need to have enough reserves in case of something unexpected. And here are some concrete things you can do as an individual. Number one, you can take action. This means moving from sinking into that adversity to action-oriented thinking. Resilient leaders tend to move quickly to forward-thinking response planning. They understand the challenge and what they can and can't control. So how we bounce back from adversity depends a lot on the degree of control that we feel. So you can increase that by taking action, and if you can, set some short-term goals so you can feel that sense of accomplishment. You can grow your relationships, especially given our work from home or remote working environment. It's really easy to feel disconnected and more alone. And as a leader, it's harder to build a deep connection with your team. Some leaders have described it as feeling like they've lost one of their senses. And during this time, you also have less obvious outlets. So find ones that you trust. It can be a colleague, it can be a spouse, mate, or even your goldfish. The important thing is finding one that you trust and that you rely on them. Be present. Our most painful thoughts are usually about the past or about the future. Our most painful thoughts are rarely about how we're feeling in the present. So focus on the present. And you can do that in a number of different ways. Folks like to meditate. And for folks that are new to meditating, you can download a simple body scan meditation and do that. or you can do mindful eating or go on mindful walks. One simple thing I mentioned to my leaders is just pause and take 5 deep breaths for 30 seconds before you start your meeting. Just that small exercise, five deep breaths, 30 seconds, really helps deactivate your flight or flight instincts. It really helps to ground you. It can really have a big difference. 5 deep breaths, 30 seconds. What you can do for a team. As a leader, it's important to show a lot of resilience, and your organization is going to look to you as a leader to understand your resilience. But the truth is, you can't carry the company on your own resilience alone. If your team looks great now, that's awesome, but they might be running on adrenaline and it may not last forever. People will eventually get burnt out. So I want to share some concrete things you can do for your team to help support them. First one is fostering social support. So creating a sense of belonging and self-confidence for your teams. And this doesn't mean avoid giving them constructive feedback. It means showing that you genuinely care for them, that you care for their growth, you care for them as humans, and that you're there to support them. So find opportunities to create connections between the team. Create psychological safety. And this means creating a space for raising concerns, asking questions, discussing mistakes, and sharing ideas, even ideas that aren't fully formulated yet. I get a lot of questions around how you create psychological safety. There's a lot of work and a lot of research that's gone into this. One of the fastest ways you can do it as a leader to create a sense of psychological safety in your group is just to be humble. It's one of the fastest ways to do it. And that means as a leader, being honest, sharing your mistakes when they happen, and even in an environment like this where things are really uncertain, just share how you're feeling. Something as small as that can go a long way to creating a sense of psychological safety. And more now than ever, instill a sense of hope and purpose. That's what people are looking for. Remind them of the bigger thing that they're working towards and that they're doing it together. And with hope and purpose, it fades over time. So it's something you'll have to constantly remind your team of. It helps them with hope and purpose to have them feel a sense of agency. So during this coronavirus period, setting input goals rather than just revenue goals is a really good example of helping people feel agency. Also, letting them set their own goals or direct their own work where possible is another good example. And make sure you celebrate the victories. Because resilience is a muscle. It's like going to the gym. You're not going to feel more resilient after the first day, and you're not going to feel more resilient after the second day. But keep going. It's going to take consistent practice and reminders, but you will get there. So, wrapped in 15 minutes. So what are the key ways again? Well, the 3 ways were to hire well, invest here, structure your process, structure your interview, look for problem solving, ambiguity, growth mindset, and values. Then measure your culture. With that, it's work backwards from what it is that you want to solve for. Look at those year-on-year trends. They're really important. Communicate, take one action, and then communicate again. And then build resilience. Build your own resilience, and then help your team build theirs. But happy to chat more or take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Justin. I love the reminder to instill hope and purpose. That was amazing. Okay, so first question for you. For founders looking to hire, how do you create a culture fit filter in the interview process, and perhaps answering from the lens of both a small team with a tight culture of early employees and co-founders, and also from a lens of teams scaling and doubling over time as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of companies tackle this in different ways. So I'll share one perspective. I think there's a culture fit filter that you can apply regardless of the size that you use. I think there's a few things that you need to tackle with that. Number one, I think it's really important to define what culture fit is. The risk with culture fit interviews is they can bring a lot of bias into your process, especially when culture fit is sometimes equated to likability or the airport test. So I think when defining culture fit, it's really important to define the values that you want to hire for. And they're usually your company values. What should raise red flags or concerns for you throughout the interview process is if you hear interview feedback that says, this person's really similar to our team, or they're going to fit right in. Or I've also heard, I can't really put my finger on it, but I really like this candidate. I think they're red flags for you that we're just talking about likability rather than a genuine culture fit. And so number one is define exactly what those values are that's really important to you. Number two is define the behaviors that you expect to see out of those values. Put another way, like define what a really good answer looks like before you go and interview them. So, for example, a lot of companies have, I'm going to pick one, like a customer-centric value. I think it's a pretty common one across companies. So a really good question would be, tell me about a time when you went out of your way to make a customer really happy, like delight them or make them satisfied. So in asking that question, it'd be helpful to understand what a good answer looks like to your company based on your own values. So is a good answer someone who puts themselves in their customer's shoes? Or is a good answer someone who was really innovative about a solution for a customer? Or is a good answer someone who goes above and beyond and fixes a process or a system in the company? And so I think it's really helpful to have that rubric so you're not so loose that you only hire people that you get along well with, but not so tight that you lose a lot of diversity in hiring. And then to your question, Tip, if you scale, I think the challenge will be calibrating interviewers over time about what a good answer to that question looks like. And then translating that for departments. So like, what does customer centricity look like in the engineering department versus the sales department, for example? And where I see companies really struggle is going from a very small size when almost everyone can interview the candidate, so they're very well calibrated, moving to a larger size when you're trying to scale exactly what your values mean to 100, 200, 500 people. That becomes incredibly challenging. And that's where I think being able to define your values, define the behaviors, and then defining what a really good answer looks like really helps you scale that to that type of size.
What's your favorite value at Thumbtack?
Own it. It's like showing this sense of responsibility where if you see a problem, you go in and you own it, you want to fix it. And it's really important for us in our culture to feel like everyone's pulling together and there's no finger pointing. It's not like, well, it's that department's problem. So own it's mine.
Awesome. Another question from the audience. For founders managing team during uncertain times, how much should you communicate what's going on with the business and how do you balance transparency?
Yeah, this one's also a hard one. So I had a chat to a few founders earlier this week about this exact topic. And I think it's really critical for founders right now to be transparent. And that's like, it's an easy thing to say, just be more transparent. But I do think there's a really delicate balance between sharing all of the information and letting employees just go work it out versus having a very corporate speak narrative. And I learned this the hard way in some companies previously where we would just share all of the information and we didn't provide any context or any narratives to it because we didn't want to shape how employees saw that information. And so we would share it. And because of just like where they sat in the organization or the context that was available to them, they drew conclusions that are actually incorrect from the data. And so that's leaning too much one side where you just share all the data and no context. And so because people are just so deep in the weeds or just don't have the context, they might draw the wrong conclusions from that. Or you take it to the other side where you're like, look, I'm going to craft the narrative for you. People just don't trust what you say at that point. And as a leader, your role is to strike that balance, which is really hard. But I think a great balance to strike is sharing your data as much as possible, like your metrics, your dashboards, whatever else it is. And then doing a voiceover as a founder or as a leader in the organization as to how that's informed the decision you've made. And then try and do that in a really low production way. You know, one surprising thing that I learned at Thumbtack was we used to have very scrappy presentations when we do our all hands. And people love that. And over time, as we continue to scale, we started to put more production value in that. We had our slides nicely done. Some leaders rehearsed and they had practice. And what we learned over time was that people just trusted less in the authenticity around it. It was the same information. It just seemed like the high production value meant that we had spent more time rehearsing and kind of putting corporate speak on the answer. And so low production value in some cases is really great. And so, for example, our co-founder recently in an all hands just did a screen share. of his data and the information he was working from. And that brings a lot of trust from employees. And the last thing I want to say about transparency is it's really easy to say, just be really transparent. It's harder to bring to life. But one reminder that might be helpful is every company is at a different point on the transparency spectrum. But transparency, I see it as really relative. It's not an absolute thing. It's not binary. And so sharing one more thing that you otherwise haven't or you otherwise wouldn't have goes a long way in terms of increasing transparency in your organization. And so that might be sharing more data or sharing the rationale behind a really difficult decision or haven't asked me anything as a founder or as a leader. And after this conversation last week, earlier this week, a founder shared that she'd written an email to the entire company talking about their cash runway and their cash position and what they were targeting. So just think of one more thing that you can share that you otherwise wouldn't have shared, and that goes a long way in a time like this.
Great. To Jay's point, Jay from Uprise, during a crisis for startups, you require all hands on deck, whether it's moving quickly, pivoting, jumping into new opportunities. At the same time, your team is facing personal problems from all angles as well, whether it's physical burnout, financial constraints, or emotional well-being because your friends and families are affected. How do founders balance the needs of the business with the needs of the team?
Yeah, another good question, tough question. Yeah, I wish I had just like a formula and an answer. So I think as you make decisions about your business, including the future of the business and the structure, including layoffs is a conversation that's going around right now, you have to prioritize the needs of the business first, while doing everything possible to do right by your employees and trying to avoid layoffs or restructuring as much as possible. But those types of decisions require you to put the business first. But I think to your point, when it comes to addressing new opportunities, you need to prioritize your people. And what I mean by that is I've seen this shift over the last decade or so, where people no longer only look to their government for safety or support. There's this greater reliance on, like, what is my employee going to do about that? And a greater reliance on employee to provide that safety and support. And so we have a huge responsibility to give it to them. And given that this is such an uncertain time, people might feel anxious, they might feel burnt out, emotionally drained, whatever it is. And if we aren't empathetic to our employees and addressing the needs of our people, number one, it probably just doesn't feel right or good. And two, they're not going to be productive anyway. And so as a leader, there's a few things you can do to help prioritize the needs of your employees, especially in this really uncertain time. One of them is to help them demarcate. Something that we lose from remote work versus where we used to go to work is those demarcation points. You go to work, you get dressed, you have a commute, you have a breakfast routine, and you lose that now. Everything is just kind of all blended together. So helping them demarcate is one way that you can help them. An example of that could just be going for a walk at the end of your workday, and that's like demarking the end of your workday. As a leader, understanding their situation, or as a founder, understanding their situation, helping them prioritize their work, helping them set clear expectations in a time where people are trying to juggle lots of different priorities, both at home and at work. As I mentioned before, creating a psychologically safe space to raise things when people feel really ready. This means making it okay to fail. And as a founder, it means sharing your own experiences. It's really powerful to hear a founder share some of their challenges working from home or working remotely, sharing some of their mistakes and sharing some of their feelings about it. And last but not least, check in. That's one of the simplest things we can do as a leader right now to prioritize the needs of our team. Check in, ask them how you're going. Empathy is so important. And I think in terms of that balance between the business and the needs of our team, if you focus and prioritize the needs of your team right now, they're going to deliver for you on the business front.
Great. Thanks, Justin. Just on the remote working point, Stuart Snyder and Marie Beer had a question around remote working trends. Do you see a move towards a predominantly remote workforce for tech companies? And if not, what are the barriers you're seeing to prevent this?
Yeah, I expect we'll see a shift towards a more remote workforce, but I'm not sure. Like, my reading is I don't think we'll see a majority of companies go 100% remote, because that's an entire paradigm shift in how a company operates. What I think will happen is we'll see companies move towards being a hybrid. So at least moving further down that remote work spectrum. So where there's more flexibility to work remotely, but the entire company isn't remote. And I think there's two trends we need to watch for there. One is, and this gets to the barriers point in the question, One is it's going to get complicated as people start to transition back into the office, or if they move into a hybrid world where some people are in the office and some people aren't, because you have to rethink your business model. For example, if you tend to have in-person meetings, but out of a meeting of 10 people, one person is working remotely, you're going to disadvantage that person who's remote. And so you need to be really thoughtful about how you transition to this hybrid type of model when you have some people in the office and some people out. The second piece, irrespective of whether you go hybrid or full remote, is keeping this single company culture. And so, a couple of ways to do that is one is keep the same tech stack used in the same way for everyone. So if you brainstorm, if you communicate through docs, always communicate through docs rather than having some in-person norms and some remote norms. And keep a sense of community, whether it's virtual water coolers, community events, whatever else it means for your company. We have the tech stack to support this, but human behavior is going to be the hardest thing to change in all of this. And lastly, whereas I think in our current world, or even the pre-COVID world, you'd have site leads who would manage like the culture and the feelings for each work site. I suspect remote will be a new site in the future world, where, especially in the hybrid world, where there'll be someone responsible for the sentiment and the culture for those that are all remote.
Great. Here's a easy question for you. Mike asked, when should you hire a full-time employee as opposed to a part-time contractor? What factors should founders consider to help make this decision?
Oh, it's a good question. Again, thanks, Mike. It's hard to answer in the abstract. I would say that look at a few different dimensions. Like, how long do you expect this work to be going on for? So we often see contractors come in for a very short period of time or a short period of a piece of work. And then two, how much of this work is a competitive advantage for you? And if it is a competitive advantage and you expect it to last into the future, I would hire that full time. Contract is really great for either a very niche piece of work that you need them to come in and do, like if you're going to help you with your SEO, SEM, for example, and you just need that for a very short period of time. Or also if you're expecting fluctuations, recruiting is a great example of that. If you have a fluctuation before like university hiring season and you need to ramp up on recruiters and ramp them down again, contract is a really good way of tackling that. But aside from that, I'd always prefer to go for full-time employees. They're just so much more invested in the business, and you want to be able to invest in them as well, which you can't really do with contractors in terms of their learning, their development, and their growth.
Awesome. Well, Justin, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for making the time for us and your very thought-provoking presentation. You are now off to the StartMate room for private Q&A. And for everyone else, I will see you nice and early tomorrow morning at 7:30 a.m. Australian Eastern Time for David Spink's session on building a world-class community and why that's crucial for startups. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. And thanks again, Justin.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Tip. See ya.